I have always loved the bustling streets of San Francisco. The rhythm of the city seemed to be synchronized with the beating of my own heart. But lately, day by day, that rhythm felt increasingly distant, as if the sounds were muffled, and I felt myself fading into the background of something vast and empty. Michael and I lived in a beautiful apartment with a view of the bay. From our window, we could see the very sight that millions of people around the world dream of witnessing at least once in their lives. One evening, when Michael was once again late at work, I stepped out onto the balcony and leaned against the railing, watching the sunset. The wind from the bay brushed my face, and in that moment, I felt it for the first time. That strange, unsettling sensation, as if something was missing from my life. I knew our relationship was growing cold, but I couldn't pinpoint where exactly we had lost each other. I remembered how we once talked about escaping the city, about how wonderful it would be to get away from all this noise and chaos. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a dream, but now it had become the only thing I could think about. Michael came home later than usual. He was buried in numbers and charts, completely absorbed in discussions with colleagues about things I didn't care about. "How was your day?" he asked, but his voice sounded as mechanical as it did during the rare moments we spoke in recent months. "Fine," I replied, and after a brief pause, I added, "I'm thinking about going to see Zach in Monterey for the weekend." Michael raised an eyebrow but didn't object. He had always been that way. He didn't have time for arguments or confrontations, especially about anything unrelated to work. "All right," he said absent-mindedly, lowering his gaze back to his laptop screen. "Say hi to him for me." His indifference struck me, but at the same time, it gave me silent permission for this escape. The drive from San Francisco to Monterey took just over 2 hours, but with every mile I traveled along the coast, the feeling of freedom grew stronger. The car was silent, interrupted only by the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. I listened to this natural orchestra, savoring every moment. The ocean seemed endless, and I realized that this was what I had been missing in the city. Space, air, an unlimited horizon. When I finally arrived in Monterey, the town greeted me with the warm rays of the setting sun and the soft murmur of the sea. Zach was already waiting for me outside his home. A low, cozy cottage tucked among the trees on a small hill. I had always envied his choice. Instead of staying in the stifling bustle of the big city, he had found his place here, among nature, in complete harmony with the world. Zach hugged me at the door and, smiling, said, "Emily, it's good to see you. It's been a while since you last came. How are you?" "Better than I expected," I replied, genuinely happy to have escaped San Francisco. "Monterey looks beautiful, as always. How are you?" "Good, but it's always the same here. The sea, the mountains, a bit of quiet. I think it's exactly what you need right now." His voice was so calm that for a moment I felt like I was already beginning to recharge. We walked inside, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee immediately wrapped me in warmth. Zach was the kind of person who always knew how to support his friends. We sat on the veranda where there was a view of the ocean. The sun was sinking into the water, painting the sky in bright shades of orange and pink. I took a deep breath of the salty air and finally felt myself relax. "How's Michael?" Zach asked, breaking the short silence. I looked at him and felt a strange mix of sadness and emptiness. He's busy as always," I replied, trying to sound as neutral as possible, though inside I was boiling with unspoken thoughts. It feels like we've drifted apart. A long time ago." Zach looked at me with understanding and nodded. "Well, sometimes distance helps you figure out yourself and what you want," he said, bringing his cup to his lips. "You'll have time to think here." We continued chatting like old friends when Zach suddenly paused, looking toward the neighboring house on the hillside, and said, "By the way, tomorrow I'll introduce you to my neighbor. David recently moved here. He's also trying to find himself after a rough time in his life." "Moved here? To this place?" I looked in surprise in the direction Zach was pointing. "Yeah. Decided to change his life after a divorce. Lives alone in silence. I think you'll like him. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and lay in bed for a long time, listening to the sound of the ocean. The remnants of yesterday's conversations with Zach still buzzed in my head. I decided to go for a walk and absorb the morning quiet of Monterey. The air was cool, the sky clear. When I returned to the house, Zach was waiting for me by the car. "So, ready to meet my mysterious neighbor?" He smiled, tying the laces of his boots. "Let's do it," I replied, though something inside me hinted that this meeting would be more significant than just a simple introduction. We got in the car and drove along a winding road heading up toward Big Sur. Soon the road narrowed and the houses began to disappear. We were moving deeper into the mountains, and the landscape around us grew wilder and more untamed. After about 20 minutes, we pulled up in front of a small house nestled among the trees on the slope. The house looked modest, but there was something special about it, as if it blended with the nature around it rather than standing apart. On the porch stood a tall man with casually tousled chestnut hair and a slight scruff. He was dressed simply: jeans, a t-shirt, and a sweater loosely draped over his shoulders. The first thing I noticed were his eyes. Calm, deep, as if they could read you from the first glance. "Hey, Zach," he said, approaching us with a faint smile. "And this must be Emily?" I nodded, feeling something strange tighten inside me. There was something about David that instantly drew attention. Maybe it was his calm demeanor or the aura of serenity that surrounded him. Something so opposite to everything I knew in San Francisco. "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand, but he simply nodded slightly and said, "Zach's told me a lot about you. Glad you could escape the city." His voice was low and warm, as if his entire being radiated peace. We moved to the veranda, where a breathtaking view of the ocean below spread out, and sat at a wooden table already set for breakfast. Zach was recounting our conversation from the previous night to David, while I quietly observed how they interacted. But even though Zach and David were old friends, I couldn't ignore the subtle energy in the air. It was as if something had sparked between David and me from the first moment we met, even though we had barely spoken to each other. After breakfast, Zach suggested going for a walk on the trails, and David agreed. We walked through dense forests where the air was fresh and crisp. Zach went ahead to take some photos, leaving David and me walking behind. "Zach said you moved to San Francisco recently?" David asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah, it's been a few years now. Michael's job brought us there," I replied. But as I said it, I realized how hollow those words sounded. My life felt foreign to me in that moment as I uttered them. David didn't pry further, and that gave me a sense of relief. We continued walking in silence, enjoying the nature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was affecting me in a strange way. There was something hidden about him, something that made me feel tense, but not in a bad way, more like a challenge. We reached the edge of a cliff, and I stopped to gaze at the ocean. Its power was mesmerizing. David stopped next to me, and I could feel his gaze on me, but I didn't dare turn around. My heart suddenly started beating faster. "This view never gets old," he said quietly, standing beside me. The three of us walked along a winding trail that led to the cliffs, offering a breathtaking view of the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks created a sense of peace, and I tried to focus on the beauty of nature, but my attention kept drifting back to David. His calm demeanor, the confidence in every movement, the mysterious aura, everything about him irresistibly drew me in. With each step, I felt this strange, inexplicable pull growing stronger, though I stubbornly tried to ignore it. Zach was walking ahead, chatting cheerfully about his latest photography project, occasionally pointing out interesting angles for shots. But I barely registered his words. My thoughts wandered elsewhere, somewhere between Michael, with whom I shared so many years, and David, whom I had only just met, but who was already having a profound impact on me. At one point, the trail narrowed, and we had to walk along the edge of the cliff. I carefully balanced on the narrow path when I suddenly felt the wind pick up sharply, snatching my scarf. Instinctively, I reached for it, ignoring the danger. In that instant, as if sensing something was wrong, David was by my side, grabbing my hand and steadying me to keep me from falling. "Careful," he said softly. But there was something more in his voice than just a warning. His hand gripped mine firmly, and for a moment I froze. The touch was unexpected, but it carried with it a strength and certainty that I hadn't felt in a long time. Something stirred inside me, though I quickly pulled my hand away, embarrassed by my reaction. "Thanks," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "It's fine." He let go, but I knew that moment between us was more than just an act of casual concern. Zach, oblivious to what had happened behind him, turned around and called out, "You guys okay back there? Just a little farther and we'll get to a great photo spot." We continued walking, but the tension between David and me lingered. I tried to distract myself by engaging in conversation with Zach, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that moment on the trail. A strange feeling of inner conflict churned within me. I reminded myself that just hours ago, I was merely a guest in Monterey, trying to escape the hustle of the city and the problems in my relationship with Michael. But now everything had changed. David's presence made me feel different. Alive, yet scared at the same time. His calm strength seemed so foreign compared to what I had grown used to in Michael. Yet I knew this feeling was dangerous, like the trail we had just walked. When we reached the lookout point, Zach immediately set up his camera tripod. David stood nearby, silently gazing out at the ocean. I approached the edge of the cliff again, fixing my eyes on the endless waves, feeling my heart beat a little faster than usual. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" David's voice was soft, but I sensed a hidden depth behind it. "Yeah," I replied shortly, not turning my head. The sea was mesmerizing, but it couldn't drown out the questions swirling inside me. Silence settled between us again, but this time it was thick with awkwardness and unspoken thoughts. I didn't know how to handle what I was feeling, or whether I even should. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves on Carmel Beach. Zach had started a small fire, and its crackling sound drowned out the soft whispers of the waves rolling onto the shore. The air was cool but not cold, and the ocean remained unchanged, quiet yet powerful in its vastness. This moment should have brought me peace, but inside, conflicting emotions raged, emotions I couldn't quite explain. We sat by the fire, the three of us, each lost in our own thoughts. Zach was recounting another story from his childhood, laughing and gesturing animatedly. I nodded in response, but barely listened. All my attention was focused on David. He sat across from me a little further from the fire, his face partially illuminated by the flames. He didn't engage in the conversation, just listened, as always, calm and focused. Soon, Zach stood up to gather more firewood, leaving David and me alone. The silence between us felt heavy, and I suddenly felt the need to say something, to break the tension that seemed to hang in the air. "Don't you get bored here by yourself?" I asked suddenly, surprised by my own question. "Bored?" he repeated, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No, not at all. If anything, it was necessary. Time alone sometimes reveals more than any conversation." He fell silent again, as if giving me time to process his words. I thought about how rarely I had this time alone for myself. In San Francisco, everything was always on the go. Work, meetings, my relationship with Michael. I often felt like I was caught in a whirlwind of obligations and expectations with no escape. And here was someone who had deliberately chosen solitude. "And what have you found here?" I continued, trying to understand what drew him to this place. So far from everything. David looked into the fire as if contemplating his answer. Then he said quietly, "Peace. After my marriage fell apart, I realized I needed to find something more than just a new job or another goal. I needed to get away from the noise, from constant distractions. I chose nature. I chose this place to rediscover who I am and what I want from life." He paused before continuing, looking directly at me. "It's hard sometimes," he said. You think you found the answers, and then you realize the questions were different all along. But it's better than living in a routine where every day feels like the one before. His words hit me deeply. My life with Michael had gradually become exactly that, a series of monotonous days filled with his work and my doubts. I hadn't felt truly alive in a long time. And you? He asked suddenly. Are you happy with your life? It was a simple question, but behind it, I sensed the weight of everything I'd been going through in recent months. I froze for a moment, realizing that he was making me confront the truth. I didn't have an answer, or maybe the answer was too obvious for me to admit. I don't know, I replied, looking away. Sometimes I feel like I've lost myself. He nodded as if he completely understood what I was feeling. That's okay, he said, his voice gentle and reassuring. Sometimes you have to get lost to find something new. At that moment, Zach returned with more firewood, interrupting our conversation. But something inside me had shifted. Those few minutes of honesty with David had stirred something in me. It made me think about where I was, what I wanted, and most importantly, what I feared. As the fire grew brighter and Zach launched into another story, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd said to David. I feel lost. Those words echoed in my mind, and I realized that what I feared wasn't that I wouldn't find a way out, but that I had already found it. And that way out might not include Michael. The next morning, we set out into the mountains again, this time to see the ocean from the heights. Zach suggested it as a perfect way to wrap up the weekend before I had to head back to San Francisco. David proposed we stop by a scenic lookout tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, from where there was an incredible view of the ocean. We arrived around midday, with the sunlight playing on the surface of the water, creating an illusion of serenity. Zach once again moved ahead, leaving David and me alone, as if it was inevitable. I wasn't sure what we would talk about, but I could feel that the silence between us wouldn't hold back the words I had been hiding for so long. We stopped at the railing and I stared out at the endless waves below. I think you feel it, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, as though he didn't want to disturb the magic of the moment, but his words reached deep inside me. What do you mean? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. He looked at me, his gaze filled with such depth that it made me uneasy. You feel the same thing I do. This isn't just friendship or a chance encounter. There's something more between us, and it's impossible to ignore. My thoughts spun, like the waves below, colliding with the reality I had been trying to escape. His words hung in the air, and there was nowhere to hide from them. I didn't know how to respond because, even inside myself, I hadn't fully acknowledged what was now being laid bare so plainly. I moved here to find myself, he began. And just when I thought I'd found peace, you appeared. I tried not to make anything of it, not to think it could mean something. But every time you're near, I feel like I can't ignore these feelings. My heart raced. These were the words I had feared hearing, because they forced me to admit to myself that I felt the same. David was so different from Michael, and that's what scared me. I didn't know what to do with these feelings, and I was terrified that if I opened up, it would change everything. It's not that simple, I finally said, feeling my voice tremble with the tension. I can't just make a decision during one trip. I have Michael. We have a future. My words felt weak, as though even I didn't believe them. David nodded quietly, but his gaze remained intense. Sometimes the future is just something we cling to out of fear of change, he said. You can keep living the way you have, but will you be happy? He leaned in and kissed me. In that moment, our lives collided, and I could no longer run from what was unfolding before me. When we returned to Zach's house, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was Michael. My heart tightened with surprise. I had almost forgotten about him over the past few days. How many times in recent months had I tried to reach out to him, hoping for some response, but he was always too busy. And now, just as my life was rapidly changing, he suddenly wanted to talk. I froze for a moment, holding the phone in my hands before I answered. Hello? I said, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. Emily, how are you? How's the weekend going? His voice sounded a little tired, but there was a genuine interest there, something I hadn't heard in a long time. It's good. I hesitated slightly. It's really beautiful here. I feel like I've finally been able to get away from everything a bit. I'm glad to hear that. He paused. I've been thinking. We haven't really talked in a while. It feels like you've been pulling away from me lately. I wanted to check in and see what's going on. Michael, you're right. I have been pulling away. It feels like we've lost each other these past few months. You're always busy, and I feel like we're just existing together, not really living. And I trailed off, feeling a lump rise in my throat. And what? He asked, his voice tinged with worry now. And I'm not sure we're heading in the same direction anymore, I finally said. My words were blunt, but I couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. Are you saying you don't love me anymore? His voice was quiet, almost broken. This wasn't the Michael I knew, and that only made it hurt more. No, it's not that, I answered, though I wasn't entirely sure of my feelings myself. I don't know what I feel, but I know that something has to change. I don't want to keep living the way we have been. It doesn't feel right. Emily, did you meet someone? He asked suddenly, his voice growing harder. It's not about that, I said, though I knew that in some way it was. Michael sighed heavily on the other end of the line. Emily. His voice trembled, and I could feel him trying to make sense of everything I had said. I thought we were just going through a rough patch, that this was all temporary. But if that's the case, if you met someone and feel something more, I don't know what to say. I don't know what's going to happen, Michael, I said. But I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I need to figure things out for myself. There was silence on the other end for a moment. I could sense his pain and confusion, and it mirrored the turmoil I was feeling inside. This conversation had been a long time coming, and even though I had feared it, I knew it was necessary. The life I had with Michael, the person I had become with him, wasn't aligned with who I was anymore. And despite not knowing what the future held, I was beginning to understand that pretending things could stay the same was no longer an option. When the conversation with Michael ended, I stayed alone on the veranda, feeling waves of confusion and guilt crash over me one after another. It was hard to grasp that I had put our relationship, something I had once thought eternal, something that had always seemed secure, at risk. But now, after these few days in Monterey, my life would never be the same. I needed time alone to find answers, so I decided to go to one of the most secluded beaches, Pfeiffer Beach. I had always loved that place, with its purple sands and massive rocks rising out of the sea like ancient guardians. The beach was almost deserted, and I felt it was the perfect place to sort through my emotions and finally make a decision. I walked slowly along the shore, leaving footprints in the damp sand, which were immediately washed away by the waves. The ocean, as always, seemed endless, and its power reminded me of how small I felt in the face of these vast forces of nature. But here, amidst this immensity, I began to feel something new, a faint but clear certainty that I could find my own path. I stopped and sat on a rock, gazing at the horizon. The wind tousled my hair, and I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. My mind wrestled between two realities. The one with Michael, safe, familiar but increasingly distant, and the one with David, the man who, in just a few days, had turned my world upside down. The evening sun painted the sky in soft pink and orange hues, and I suddenly felt like I was on the verge of something important. I remembered the conversations Michael and I had about the future, about a house by the ocean, and how we once dreamed of building a life together. But reality had turned out to be much more complicated. I realized that our dreams had perhaps been a way to cover up the growing distance between us. We had become different people, and it was terrifying to admit that. David. His appearance in my life had been something unexpected, as if he had arrived at just the right moment when I needed that push the most. I couldn't deny that he had awakened something in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. Passion, excitement, a renewed interest in life that I had lost in San Francisco. But I also knew that my feelings for David were new and unexplored, and basing my entire life on that could be dangerous. He was merely a catalyst, a moment of truth that had forced me to look deeper into myself. I closed my eyes and felt the salty wind gently brush my face. I could no longer hide from my feelings. The answer was right in front of me. I couldn't stay with Michael any longer, no matter how painful it was. I still loved him, but our connection had faded, and pretending that everything was the same would only betray both him and myself. The sun was almost gone beneath the horizon, and I felt a strange yet long-awaited sense of relief settle within me. My decision was made. I had to end things with Michael, not because of David, but because I could no longer live in this illusion. I needed to figure out who I was and be ready for new challenges, even if it meant starting over completely. When the call with Michael ended, I sat on the veranda, feeling a mix of confusion and guilt washing over me. It was hard to process that I had put our relationship, something I had once thought of as permanent, at risk. But after these past few days in Monterey, I knew my life could never be the same. I couldn't delay the inevitable anymore. I had to talk to Michael and be honest with him. I took my phone, dialed his number, and hit the video call button. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the screen. Michael answered almost immediately. His face appeared. Familiar, but somehow distant. "Hey, Emily." "Good to see you," he said with a smile. "How's the weekend?" I tried to smile back, but I felt my facial muscles betraying me. "Hi, Michael. We need to talk." "Is something wrong? You look serious." I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "Yes, I need to be honest with you. Lately, I've been feeling that something's changed between us. We've grown distant. Emily, if this is about work, I understand. But this is temporary. Once the project is over, I'll have more time for us." "It's not just about work, Michael. I met someone here. His name is David." For a moment, silence hung between us. His face paled and his eyes widened in shock. "You're saying you met someone?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, but it's not just about him. David helped me realize how distant we've become. I can't ignore these feelings anymore." Michael looked away, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe this. After everything we've been through. We talked about our future, about a house by the ocean, about a family. I know, and I'm so sorry. But I can't lie to you or to myself anymore. I need to figure out what I'm feeling." He looked back at me, his eyes a mixture of pain and anger. "So, what are you suggesting? That we just throw everything away? 5 years of our relationship gone because of some guy you've known for a few days? I never planned for this, but I can't keep going like this. It's not fair to you." "Fair?" He scoffed bitterly. "What's not fair is that you've made this decision for both of us without giving me a chance to fix things. I tried talking to you, but you were always busy. You were distant, and I didn't know how to reach you. Maybe because I was working for our future? To provide us with that house by the ocean you always dreamed of? But what's the point of a house if there's no happiness in it? We've lost our connection, Michael." He fell silent, clenching his jaw. I could see him struggling with his emotions. "Emily," he finally said, his voice strained. "If you think you'll find happiness with this David, then maybe I didn't know you as well as I thought. Please, try to understand. I don't want to hurt you, but I have to be honest." "Honest?" His voice wavered. "After you've kept this from me?" I only realized how serious it was recently. I didn't want to hurt you. "You know what hurts the most?" he said, looking at me again. "That you didn't give us a chance to fix things. You just decided to leave. I'm not leaving for good. I need time. We both need time to think." "Time? For what?" So you can figure out your feelings for someone else? It's not that simple. It's perfectly simple, Emily, he interrupted. You've made your choice. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I'm so sorry. Sorry? He repeated. Yeah, I'm sorry too. Sorry I wasted so much time on someone who's ready to destroy everything in an instant. The screen went black, the connection cut off. I sat there holding my phone, realizing the bridges had been burned. Pain and relief intertwined inside me, creating a strange sense of emptiness. Zach stepped out onto the terrace, noticing my state. Everything okay? He asked cautiously. I looked up at him, searching for the right words. I talked to Michael. I told him everything. He nodded, sitting down beside me. Tough conversation? Very. But I had to do it. I understand. What's your plan now? I looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the ocean. I don't know, but now I have the chance to figure things out, to start fresh. Zach put a hand on my shoulder. I'm always here if you need anything. I smiled at him through my tears. Thank you, Zach. You're a true friend. Inside, my emotions were still churning, but I knew I had done the right thing. Michael deserved the truth, just as I deserved the chance to find my happiness, no matter how difficult the path ahead would be. The morning was crisp, and the sun's rays gently touched the ground as I packed my things and said goodbye to Zach outside his home. There was a lightness in the air, but also a sense of uncertainty, as if, with the rising sun, a new chapter of my life was beginning, one that was still a mystery to me. Take care of yourself, Emily, Zach said, hugging me. And remember, you always know where to find me. I smiled gratefully. Thank you for everything, Zach. You really helped me figure things out. I needed this. He nodded, his expression turning serious. The most important thing is not to be afraid of being honest with yourself. Life is complicated, but you'll get through it. As I drove away, I stopped at one of the lookout points. The sound of the waves filled the silence, and I took a deep breath. This moment felt like a symbol of my new journey. Solitary, yet free. I stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out at the vast ocean, feeling something inside me shift. I was no longer the woman who had arrived in Monterey just a few days ago, full of doubts and anxieties. Now I realized that I could live my own life and make my own choices. The horizon stretched out before me, endless and full of possibility.